Do you have a sense that people are coming to like actual conclusions that are sustaining and can sort of see them through all the different, life events that might come their way?
So you know how sometimes you talk about people being spiritual and not religious, that kind of classic phrase. I think there are also people who are religious but not spiritual, people who feel so unmoored in life and feel kind of floating in midair, trying to get to the ground as well through ordering religion.
This is Life and Faith, a podcast where we put aside talk of culture war or all the stuff we seem to disagree about and talk about the human longings and experiences we all share that make up the mystery of life and faith. Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Natasha Moore.
You are Natasha Moore, and you've been away for some time on maternity leave, Natasha. We haven't heard your voice on Life and Faith for a while. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be back. And today's episode has been a really fun one to kind of ease back in with.
Yeah, it's a great episode. We're looking forward to this. Now, today we are covering a story that's been building for a while. Now, all of us at CPX have been hearing noises out of the UK about people, and especially young people, showing more interest in spiritual things in general, but particularly in Christianity and in going to church. Now, it's not only in the UK, we'll talk about that shortly, but there does seem to be something specific going on there. And of course, this is intriguing to us, and it's a bit surprising, Natasha.
Yeah, this is very much CPX interest territory.
Yeah.
There's a lot of buzz about this shift if you kind of are listening in the right channels. A few of us on the CPX team have been reading a book that's just come out actually from a young British writer called Lamorna Ash. She became interested in people's experiences of Christianity after two of her uni friends kind of quite unexpectedly converted. And she's travelled the length and breadth of the UK to talk to people who are wrestling with various forms of Christian faith. So her book that's just out is called Don't Forget We're Here Forever, A New Generation's Search for Religion.
Yes, and she might be someone we need to get on a future episode of Life and Faith, perhaps.
Yeah.
Regular listeners of Life and Faith will remember a conversation I had last year with Justin Briley about his book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Now, he's also someone who's been picking up on this trend towards faith. And he did say to me, I don't think this is just me. I don't think this is just a few anecdotes. I think something new is happening. And now we can report that the data is in and a report has come out that's confirmed that sense of the church is growing, faith is becoming more popular in the UK specifically. Now, this report is called The Quiet Revival, and it's been released by the British and Foreign Bible Society. And later in this episode, we're going to hear some of those quite startling numbers from one of the authors of the report.
Yeah, to give you just a sneak preview here, the survey found that there are more than 2 million more people going to church in England and Wales today than there were back in 2018, which is when they last ran the survey. Now, we, of course, are interested in why that might be, what it is people are looking for and maybe finding in the church, and what the impact will be or could be for them and for the wider culture.
Yes, and in today's episode, we're bringing you a couple of different angles, different conversations to explore what on earth is happening over in the UK. So Justine Toe spoke with an Aussie who spent a bit of time in London recently and going to churches over there for a kind of insider-outsider perspective.
Justine also spoke with Daniel Kim. Technically, he's appeared on the podcast before, though not by name. If you listen to our first Life and Faith episode for this year with Rod Dreyer, that was about wonder and the spiritual realm. He spoke about a young English guy that he met who was training to be a vicar, a pastor, who used to work in advertising in London, in Soho, where this young man that he met said that he had been the only Christian in his office, which maybe not that unusual. But it wasn't that everyone else was an atheist. Actually, everyone else he worked with, he said, was into the occult in some way. They believed in other spiritual things. Now, Justine realised that Rod Dreher was talking about Daniel Kim, who is also a research student at Oxford. He's written some really interesting things about contemporary spirituality, and we've been wanting to get him on the podcast for a while. So we are starting this conversation with Daniel and his experience of where his generation, Gen Z, is up to with belief and spiritual seeking.
Rod Dreher loves that story, and I suppose I would kind of nuance it a bit. I think he uses the language of devil worshippers, but I think I would perhaps say there's a more broader spectrum of people who are kind of open to the occult, open to esoteric thoughts, open to things like astrology, witchcraft, and just a wider, almost marketplace of ideas of neo-pagan spiritual worldviews. And just for me, maybe a place to start really is my background, because growing up, I was kind of, born in 95, like sort of super late millennial, early Gen Z. And so at school, I was very much inducted with sort of Richard Dawkins style new atheism. So my peers and my friends just absolutely wrecking Christianity with facts and logic from science and the atheists. And so, growing up as a Christian, I really armed myself, I suppose, with the arguments that were quite rational. So, did Jesus really exist? Did he really rise from the dead? How reliable is the Bible? All these kind of more, rational questions that you kind of have to contend with people who are very strong on analytic philosophy and science and this kind of stuff. And so, when I went into the workplace, I kind of thought, as a Christian, I want to represent my faith thoughtfully in a way that isn't too over the top, but also, having the right kind of intellectual background for myself. But I distinctly remember a moment. It was really clear. I was having lunch in Soho in London with my colleagues, advertising, so probably a pint in hand quite early in the day. And there's a distinct moment when I realized that sitting around with my colleagues, I felt like the rational atheists that I used to argue with at school. So all my peers in that moment were talking about their star signs, their birth charts, talking about the books they read about neo-pagan rituals and about the birth of witchcraft and these kind of different esoteric ideas, and talking about them in a very systematic way as opposed to kind of a vague sense of horoscopes. There's a very sort of systematic conversation about these kinds of ideas and thoughts. And in my own heart of hearts, even though I'm a Christian, I was like, oh, that's all just complete garbage, isn't it? That's all just complete insanity. Like, how can you possibly believe this?
You became a new atheist, didn't you?
Yeah, in that moment, I was like, oh my goodness. And then I had to catch myself thinking, no, wait, I can't say that as a Christian. I can't be the one making these claims of like, that's clearly just pre-modern superstition, because that's exactly what I've been trying to defend against.
Your internal reaction to all this is like, oh, look, I sound like the new atheist now, but I'm a Christian. What did they make of you, though?
They're very, very tolerant, very open. I suppose I didn't express my doubt in what they were saying. I was just sort of listening and taking in what they were saying and sort of wrestling with my own inner self of how am I going to square this new cultural environment with my faith and engage with it in a very different kind of way than I am used to. So I think they made of me as, someone with a deep spiritual life, someone clearly connected with a spiritual tradition, and they're very open to it. People were quite open to me, offering prayer sometimes. I've got almost no pushback about my faith. I think openness is perhaps the best way to describe it, I would say.
What's your sense of people's openness to the spirituality? And let's now take it beyond your kind of colleagues when you were working, because that might be a self-selecting kind of group in a particular way.
Yeah.
So when you're on the streets, are you feeling a vibe? What's your sense of what's out there?
What's so funny is the word vibe itself comes from an esoteric worldview, right? Vibrations, Okay. It's funny, isn't it? Yeah. I get asked this question a lot because actually my research area is in this exact area as well. So I went into my entire training with this in mind as well. I think like all cultural changes, it is highly multivariant in terms of the causal factors of it. I think one defining characteristic of our time today is that there isn't really a single mainstream anymore. Whereas previously we have kind of a mainstream cultural river that people kind of swim in, same film, same book, same music. I think given the current ways we interact with content and our own sort of algorithmic curated spaces, I think there isn't really a mainstream. So I think what I'd say is this kind of spiritual openness is affecting quite a significant subculture within the wider diverse tributaries of culture. I think it is a significant movement, but I think it's hard to talk about any mainstream nowadays. So I'll start with that. In terms of why I think this is happening, first, I do think there is a vibe shift, perhaps not in the American way, that is true, but also in a more general sense of an openness towards things. I think there are lots of different ways you can take it. So one common way I would say is, young people react against what's gone before them. And I suppose given 2 or so generations of broadly secularized people in the UK, so and lots of people who grew up with not even first generation atheists, but second generation atheists, whose grandparents even were secular, and they're coming to the world completely untouched by spirituality. And so, without anything to react against, I suppose, it's a very natural thing to want to explore deeper things in life and spirituality. So young people are very they have no gripes about engaging with religion, spirituality, esoteric thought. I think also there is just a sense that the kind of promise of the new atheism just failed. I think the promises post 9/11 of like a truly enlightened secular world where the atheists won and God is dead and politics will become more peaceful, this clearly hasn't happened. Young people feel profoundly disillusioned, disenchanted, alienated from the promise of postmodern culture. So I think there is just a desire to go beyond, desire to transcend, a desire to get to the deeper truths of human life.
Of course, an increase in spiritual openness and a corresponding decline in atheism doesn't have to imply a return to Christianity. But in fact, both the anecdotal and the statistical evidence is suggesting just that. Natasha spoke with Rob Barward-Symmons from British and Foreign Bible Society about the report he co-authored called The Quiet Revival.
In 2018, we undertook a massive survey of adults across England and Wales with a reputable polling company called YouGov of 19,000 people, not just churchgoers, but across all adults, really to get an understanding in kind of some more depth and complexity about what the spiritual makeup of the country was. Where did people fit in their attitudes towards faith in the Bible, their behaviours and their priorities, their life satisfaction, things like that, so that we could kind of get a better understanding. And that in itself was pretty groundbreaking research and really helped us to frame our work. And last year, in October, we ran this again. Same questions, same polling company, this time with 13,000 adults, to see, what's the situation now. We've had a lot go on in the time in between. Obviously, COVID has been a big impact, big kind of cultural shift. But over the course of 5 or 6 years, you realise a lot can change. And so we wanted to see what the landscape was. And that's kind of where this incredible findings came from that really kind of took us aback.
Yeah. So what were you kind of expecting? And was that what you got?
We had been hearing stories from people involved in the church and from, campus ministries and things like this, that there had been something different going on, that there was more openness, there was more engagement, that people were turning up at churches that hadn't turned up before. But it's easy to kind of think that's just anecdotes and the odd story. And so we approached it not necessarily thinking anything sizable on that front. We were thinking maybe, churchgoing would be steady. But then when the data came through and it showed this just remarkable rise in churchgoing, particularly among young adults, it really took us aback. But then suddenly we were re-reflecting on all these stories we heard and thought, actually, maybe that was just the kind of drop in the ocean of what's going on. Those are just they're
representative of something.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this data, which shows this kind of rise. So in 2018, we saw that 4% of young adults 18 to 34 were attending church. That's now gone up to 16%. That kind of rise and the overall rise among adults from 8% to 12% attending at least monthly, was being borne out in these stories, and people saying, we've had young men just show up and knock on our door and say they want to get involved, and campuses where they're having to restart ministries because there's a new wave of interest. Church leaders saying, we're not really equipped for this. And so once we then looked back and heard all these stories again and more people coming through, you go, actually, there's something real going on there.
And, you kind of mentioned there, those numbers are even more pronounced for young men, right?
Yeah. So among young people, as I say, there's this rise from 4% to 16%. And among young men, that's actually a rise of 4% to 21%.
21% of young men in England and Wales are now attending church at least monthly.
At least monthly, yeah.
That sounds insane, right?
It really does. It really does. And there are kind of two, I guess, perceived, known facts about churchgoing. One was that there would be a steady generational decline. It might level off a bit, might steady out, but there was no way back, really. That was the assumption. And the second was that it was higher among women than among men, religiosity and engagement with the church ceremony. So for these two findings to come out together, really both shook things up. And I should make clear, it's not that young women aren't also increasing in significant numbers. They are. There have been some areas around the world where young men have been joining the church and young women have been leaving the church. That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing young women also excited and energized and go to church. But it's just they've been outpaced by young men.
When I asked Rob why he thinks young people in particular are finding church and Christian faith a live option for them in ways we might not have anticipated 5 or 10 years ago, he reinforced some of what Daniel Kim was saying about dissatisfaction with the certainties of new atheism, about disillusionment and the search for meaning.
One of the things, firstly, I guess, it's very easy when you see a trend in a chart to assume that that's more or less going to continue. So we continue to see the decline among Gen X. So there's kind of middle-aged folk who perhaps were raised in the church and have turned away, and we continue to see them dropping off. But what's becoming clear, actually, is perhaps they were a distinctive generation. And we've seen instead this culture shift over the past 20 years or so, wherein there was this real peak of new atheism, and kind of the attitude towards Christianity in the church was marked by hostility and skepticism and kind of aggressive anti-feeling towards church. But actually that's shifted, I think, towards apathy. People just not really caring. But then that's more towards kind of openness and curiosity among young people who weren't raised in the church, who weren't kind of defined by this exposure to new atheism, or if they were, it was when they were kind of 14, 15 and they had this very simplistic idea, and those kind of ideas are not really satisfying to them anymore. And alongside that, you've got this rise in public figures being more comfortable talking about their faith and going to church, and young people being more comfortable talking about it with each other. So you've got this culture shift happening where Christianity is kind of more acceptable. But then alongside that, we know that this younger generation is one that has a lot of struggles with mental health, with a search for meaning, with a search for belonging, and a search for kind of a deeper healing and a deeper sense of why they're here. And we know we've seen a lot of young people, particularly young men, led into some very toxic spaces in searching for answers there. But actually, we're also therefore seeing a lot of young people instead looking to the church as a space wherein they can find out who they are, where they fit, what their community can be, and these deeper answers to who they are and what the world is, I guess.
Yeah, some of the well-being results in the survey are really dramatic, and some of the kind of most intriguing of the report, I think. Things like, 75% of churchgoers agree that their life feels meaningful, as compared to 49% of non-churchgoers. And then among young people, that's, 80% say their life feels meaningful, as opposed to 52% of non-church-going young people. There's a bunch of those to do with I'm happy with my life right now, or feeling anxious or depressed, or feeling hopeful about their future. What do you make of those kinds of significant disparities?
As someone who really believes in the value of the Christian faith and of the church in my life, it is so encouraging to see that being evidenced in this way among young people. Young people are 2.5 times more likely to say they feel close to people in their local area if they go to church than if they don't. That is a massive difference in people's lives, and we are seeing that it is linked to kind of this positive fruit within young people. So among, we know that particularly among young women, anxiety, depression is a real issue that we're facing as a society. And among churchgoers, they're 1.5 times less likely to say they frequently feel anxious or depressed than non-churchgoers. No, there is still a significant number of young people, of young women within the church who do struggle with this. That needs to be a concern for everyone. But that's really remarkable and exciting. And I think also should be an indication to perhaps some of the skeptics, perhaps some of those people who do say, oh, well, they're probably all angry young men who have been drawn to the church for whatever reason. Going, this is making a positive difference in their lives. And one of the other interesting things we see from that is those who say they're Christian and go to church record highest on this, but those who say they're Christian and don't go to church actually record the lowest on these metrics.
Yeah.
There's something about it's not just ticking Christian on a form that does this. There's something about getting involved in church and taking your faith seriously.
Yeah, because it's also not just going to church either, is it? It's not just, well, being part of a community group is good for you, which it is, right?
Yeah, so there is a possibility here that this is just a lot of young folk looking for something to do, looking for a community, and church is free, and maybe they're offering some food. Great, go along. But what we see throughout the survey is these young people who say they're going to church are also reading the Bible, are also praying, also believe in a God who can make a difference in their lives. They have their questions, they have their struggles, of course, but overall they kind of look as you'd expect churchgoers to look. So yes, they're finding community in church, but it's not just a kind of social club for them.
Yeah.
It's deeper, it's impacting their lives, it's impacting their personal lives. We also see that churchgoers are more likely to make a difference in their local community, to get involved in kind of public action. So more likely to donate their money, donate their time to charitable causes, donate to food banks. The need for food banks has risen at an alarming rate over the last decade. They're more likely to get involved in their local community in terms of kind of litter picking and things like this. So they're being propelled to action to help those around them as well, which again, we're seeing that being a real difference in people's lives.
You're listening to Life and Faith, and we're discussing the UK's quiet revival. So called because people seem to be identifying with Christian faith and going to church in increasing numbers. But it's not some dramatic, obvious thing. It might just be a handful of people in a given congregation, but across the country that adds up. We're going to come back to Rob Barward-Symmons and the reliability of these quite startling survey results, and also to Daniel Kim and what young people are looking for in terms of religion and religious experience. But first, to give us an Australian's perspective on how this quiet revival feels from the inside, Justine spoke with Bri Walsh. Bri spent some time in the UK back in 2022 and could see in the church experiences she was having then some of this shift we've been talking about today.
I wanted to go there, I guess, for a holiday as well as with the intent to work over there. So I quit my job. I bought a one-way ticket, basically. It kind of ended up becoming a bit more of like a sabbatical, I've been calling it.
For Bri, as for so many young Australians who head over to the UK on a working visa, this was a time of soul-searching for her.
I think you grow up with a narrative of how you think your life will play out, and, you know, whether that's having a really strong vocation or a job that you're really kind of pushing towards, or finding a life partner and, you know, getting married. I guess the time that I was at where I went to the UK, you know, being a single young woman, also not feeling a particularly strong vocation. I wasn't starting a family. And I have other friends who are kind of in that position where you have a lot of freedom to then explore. There wasn't a clear path that I felt I was following, which can be daunting but also incredibly freeing.
Bri is a Christian, and she attended a range of different churches during her time in the UK. She attended charismatic congregations, which are known for an emphasis on spiritual experience and worship. and also more traditional services like evensong.
Something that really struck me, the church that I was kind of mostly going to, I'd visited a couple. They had a night where if there was anyone who was new or was interested in becoming more regular, could go and meet the pastor. And something that he had said to me struck me is that he hoped and expected that God would turn up during the service. And I think that's something in reflection is kind of like, oh, well, yes, that, it's like an assumed thing, but it felt like there was a real genuine desire for God to be present and to turn up. And I feel like that was quite tangible in the way services played out. As a collective in that congregation, it was like there was a real anticipation and an expectation that God would turn up.
And what church was that at? And it was a charismatic church?
No, it was St. Paul's in Hammersmith.
Okay.
Which, if I recall correctly, grew out of Holy Trinity Brompton. So I think it was technically like Church of England, but yeah, felt very charismatic in flavour.
Yeah.
I think something else that did stand out is just as a city, London demographically is incredibly multicultural. And so when you put that in maybe a church context, you're going to have also, a very diverse group of people who come from very diverse church traditions or backgrounds. And I wonder if that leads to perhaps an openness to hearing about how other people do church or experience God in ways that might not be what they kind of grew up with.
Did you have any experiences that you're happy to share with us? If you remember back to that time when the pastor was like, oh, I hope and I expect that God's going to show up. Do you remember anything that happened that night?
Yeah. Over the course of several weeks, there would be people getting up the front sharing quite, amazing experiences that they had either personally had with God working in their lives or sharing stories of other people. There would be people having particular words or messages to give to other people in the congregation. And that was quite moving to see people being like, oh, yeah, that actually speaks to me. And that was happening almost every week. Something that I experienced, which was very profound, was so what drew me to this church in particular is that they had just started an arts ministry, so trying to network people of faith within the church and also the wider context who were with a creative background or within the arts. And so I went to one of these networking evenings and I had a lady come up to me who thought she had recognised me, which wasn't possible because I was from the other side of the world. And she asked if she could pray for me and basically just spoke things she could not have possibly known. Part of that too was I'd been journaling a lot, working through some of this stuff that I was thinking about during my time there. And so I'd been quite literally writing these questions to God in this journal. And so when this lady was praying for me, it was almost like she was just saying the answers to some of those questions. And that was, incredibly moving. There's nothing like a good cry in public.
What was it that why did those words make you burst into tears or start crying? What sort of thing were you being told?
I think being in that limbo state of not knowing if I would get a job or not, where I would be living, how long will this process take? Maybe I need to go on some sort of spiritual retreat and to really feel like, I can give God that time. And there was a whole bunch of things. And so what was said to me by this lady was, she's like, I feel like God is saying, I'm already here. I'm already with you. You don't need to go somewhere else, or I'm already here. You're just sitting in this kind of blank space, and that's okay. You just need to just be. And I think the most beautiful thing that she said to me was, you're dancing in the unknown. Just keep dancing. Try not to worry about what's to come. I've got that covered.
Can I get a sense of, if you know, like the other people around you at that church, were they sort of going, there's something weird happening here, or was this like normal for them?
I stepped in thinking, okay, this is just how they do things. But I started to gather a sense that, no, there was definitely something going on. I had inquired about joining like a small group they were running groups during the week, and I didn't hear back from anyone for quite some time, which is sort of surprising, I think, from at least my experience in Sydney. Everyone's quite eager. Oh, someone wants to join. Everyone's quite eager to welcome them in. And then when I did hear back, it wasn't out of a lack of, it sounded like the church had basically doubled in a very short amount of time, and that, which is a wonderful problem to have, but it meant that I guess the usual processes hadn't had time to grow with the rate of the church growing. There were times where the normal running of service, I remember the one week the pastor getting up, typically at, you'd have sort of like your worship songs, and then you'd move into, say, a more structured part of the service. But he said, oh, I'm actually not going to do what I'd planned. I feel like we just need to really sit in the worship that was happening. And that just kept going. And as I sort of mentioned, people getting up the front and just sharing, experiences that they had had, or particular words for people. So things like that, I was like, okay, no, there's definitely something going on. And visiting other churches and seeing similar things happening, not in just one isolated congregation.
Now, we're all inclined, of course, to think that the plural of anecdote is data, that you add up enough personal stories and experiences and that equals a trend, which it might do, but it's hard to tell without the concrete numbers to back it up. So back to Rob Barward-Symmons then, and the Quiet Revival Report, and whether we can trust what it's telling us about the bigger picture behind experiences like Bri's and Daniel's.
These results are kind of so dramatic and so counter to just prevailing wisdom. And, given how often polls in recent years have proven to be a bit misleading, how confident can we be about these results in terms of how the survey was carried out and what else could be going on, what could be, showing false positives here?
Yeah, well, I actually, given speaking to Australian audience, I got an email from YouGov who undertook the survey for us yesterday, and they were very proudly proclaiming that they were the most accurate pollster in predicting the latest Australian election.
Oh, there you go. Because there was nobody foresaw how this would go.
Well,
so
YouGov did. So,
okay.
Obviously, so this is a very different type of polling, but we intentionally used a secular pollster. Of course, we helped them with developing it, but they used their standard methodology. So it's all nationally weighted to make sure you've got the correct representation of adults from different groups. It is done to the highest standard they would normally do. And so in the UK, a high quality national survey would be around 3,000 people. So ours is 13,000 to allow us to do some extra detailed digging on it. But so really it is kind of the gold standard of this kind of polling. Now, there are always going to be challenges with this kind of thing of what we call self-reported responding. So let's say if we ask people how often they exercise, you would imagine people are going to say they exercise more than they do, maybe because
units of alcohol drunk each week. Yeah,
exactly. Maybe because they go, okay, this week was a bad week, but last week was a good week. So put the good week.
Usually,
like yeah. But you expect that to be consistent. So what's significant here is the difference between 2018 and 2024, because 2018 is a long time ago, but it's not like suddenly people were telling the truth to everyone at every turn, and now they're lying to every pollster they see. There's no reason why that would be different. And we've gone back to YouGov, when the data came through and it was as remarkable as it was, we went back and said, are you sure? Can you check again? What about
Run
this?
those
what about
numbers
this? What
for
about
us.
this? Yeah, and they did, and they were like, no, we're happy with it. So it is a remarkable finding, but not to say, of course, that you can be running 3 years' time and you get a very different result.
Do you have a sense, is this kind of something that's happening in the UK specifically, like what's in the water over there? Or do you have a sense of whether this is reflected in other parts of the world, maybe in the Western world?
What's interesting is it does seem to be kind of similar trends happening across the West. And I guess the first indication I saw statistically at any point was in the US. Now, partly they've got enormous resources to run lots of surveys, and especially with a unusually large Christian population for a Western context. Data that came out last year that was showing that, again, among young men, there was this particular rise in church engagement, church attendance. There was a decline in young women. So it wasn't quite what we were seeing, but there was something kind of similar thing. But over in France, there have been reports of a massive rise in Catholic baptisms, particularly among young adults. And that's one of the things, the interesting things around our data is that this rise in young people is particularly seen among Catholics and Pentecostals. Been this enormous rise in both those traditions. So in France, their huge year-on-year rise in baptisms of particularly 18 to 25-year-olds.
Fascinating.
So that's evidence. Then in Australia, we have seen some data that's saying that kind of for the first time, young men are more likely to be Christian than young women. And we're seeing kind of shifts around young people engaged more in Christianity, even in places like Finland and Norway and those Nordic countries, where those are typically kind of seen as the hotbed of secularization. That actually there's a shift happening there as well. So these are all a series of different data points that are happening across different contexts. But you're seeing something going on.
What about among non-churchgoers in the UK? Like, is this just a kind of newfound interest in Christianity, or you think across the board there's more kind of spiritual openness and openness to things other than Christianity?
There's one believable frame in which you've seen this rise in churchgoers and in people particularly engaged in active Christianity among this generation, but they are becoming more and more separated from the rest of society, you know. And although it may be rising, it's just a niche. But actually, we've not seen that at all. We've seen that the church-going rise is kind of one end of a wider phenomenon. So that generation as a whole are more likely to say they believe in God. So 45% of young adults say there's probably or definitely a God, God's or higher power. And that's up from 28% in 2018. So from 28% to 45% of the generation saying they believe in God. When we asked, what do you mean by that? It was what we might understand as kind of Christian interventionist God who wants to get involved in people's lives as the most likely option for people to choose.
Wow.
And that's higher than any other age group other than the over 65s. We also see that 37% say they're praying at least monthly. And again, if you think 16% are going to church monthly, you know, you've then got another big chunk saying they're praying monthly. And when we asked about spiritual practices more widely, close to half said they'd done some form of spiritual practice over the past 6 months, and those are both higher than the overall average. So that's kind of generation as a whole. But then when we look at non-churchgoers specifically, more than a third of 18 to 24-year-old non-churchgoers, this is, say they would go to a church if they were invited by a friend. And again, that's higher than any other group other than the over 65s. And a quarter of non-churchgoers say they're interested in learning about the Bible. So that's still a minority of non-churchgoers. But it shows that this openness and interest is not limited to those who turned up at church doors. And we also see that there's this, I was saying earlier on about the cultural shift. Part of that has been a kind of openness and comfort with people talking about their faith. So young people are more likely to agree than not that it's good for Christians to talk about their faith with non-Christians, right? So there's not this closed door, not interested.
Keep it to yourself.
Yeah, it's a kind of, this is part of who you are, share it with the world. And we've seen a lot of talk over the past decade or so around identity politics with young people in particular. And I think this might be kind of a really healthy expression of that, of saying, if this is part of who you are and part of what matters to you, firstly, kind of share it with the world and be comfortable with that. But secondly, I think that also explains why we are also seeing at the same time in England and Wales, we're continuing to see a decline in people identifying as Christian. And for me, that is, particularly among young people, that is coming from a sense of going, actually, that label matters. that means something. That's not a cultural label. That's something that matters to people. And so that's not me. So I'm not going to tick it. So I'm going to tick non-religious. So you simultaneously, strangely, get this rising active Christianity and a decline in nominal Christianity in terms of people just ticking it without living it.
This openness to hearing about other people's beliefs is something that Bri Walsh says that she's found when talking to friends about her own spiritual experiences.
Have you shared anything of what you experienced with other people, and how do they make sense of it?
Yeah, I have shared that story with colleagues or ex-colleagues, and I've kind of been surprised. I think maybe I have my own perhaps fears of the way people might perceive my spiritual experiences or my faith. But yeah, people are just, I think they've had a genuine interest. There's a genuine curiosity, and I sort of feel a bit like, a bit chided and
As in, like, you were expecting kind of people to be like, what are you talking about?
I don't want to hear about or don't want to talk about that. And then you sort of find they're asking questions and you're sharing more and more, and maybe not necessarily particularly relating to that experience, but whether they've seen something in the media or they're like, so, what's your take on that? Or, it was a profound personal experience that you kind of, like I was sharing and offering up. There's a vulnerability in that. And I think people really respond to that. I think at the end of the day, it becomes a personal connection. So it's about relationship. There's a trust then in perhaps them feeling like, I can ask you this, or we can talk about that particular subject or whatever it may be. And I try to be a listener, just having a posture of curiosity, I guess, and listening and not presenting a judgment or this is actually what I think. I think people really respond to that.
So where is all this heading? Here are a few last thoughts. First from Daniel Kim and then Rob Barward-Symmons.
So you've talked about like young people's openness, and before you'd said that openness seems to be the word that helps to sum all this up. I'm remembering C.S. Lewis, who said something about, it's good to open your mind, but the idea of opening your mind is to fix it on something solid, to, find the right thing, to not close it on necessarily, but like, he says you open your mouth, but then you, maybe it's like taking a bite out of a burger or something. Like you want to land it on something solid and substantial. Do you have a sense that people are coming to like actual conclusions that are sustaining and can sort of see them through all the different types of, life events that might come their way?
So, how sometimes you talk about people being spiritual, not religious, right? That kind of classic phrase. I think there are also people who are religious but not spiritual, in the sense that they're grasping after systems of thoughts that are more hidden, that provide for them less a sense of transcendence, but a profound sense of just being here and being ordered and having a sense of getting your life together in some ways. I think that's very much one of the other directions of travel for this, not just people living in some disenchanted universe trying to seek out God transcendence, but also people who feel so unmoored in life and feel kind of floating in midair, trying to get to the ground as well through ordering religion.
I feel like that's the Jordan Peterson side of things.
Yeah,
perhaps.
exactly. Yeah. So I think certainly I know lots of people personally who I think in their spiritual investigations end up in a more sort of traditional form of Christianity. And there are lots of people converting to like Eastern Orthodox forms of Christian faith, the Roman Catholic Christian faith, as well as lots of people coming into sort of more low church evangelical, so kind of like, guitars and drums, that kind of Christian faith, because they find in it something that both gives them a sense of purpose and wider existence in life, as well as a sense of ordering principles that kind of make their life more sustainable, I suppose. So then there is a group of people who are the kind of desire for spiritual transcendence as well as ordering kind of come together. And I think when those two come together, I think often they land in some kind of religious tradition, whether it's Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, often more traditional forms, I would say. Then I think there are people who don't care too much about the ordering aspects of spirituality, and it's almost purely about a desire for spiritual knowledge, a kind of desire to always get under the surface of whatever is happening in the world. And so, I came across this one guy in the pub recently who actually, this was a hilarious conversation because he is a technician at, I think, the astrophysics department. So, very sort of science-minded, new atheist kind of initially. I was having a chat with him outside, And at first, I told him I was a priest in training, and he was like, "Oh, I'm not really into that kind of stuff. I'm an atheist." I was like, "Oh, cool. That's fair enough. And just have a nice chat." And then I told him about my research, that I worked on esoteric thought and the occult and spirituality. Then immediately he's like, "Oh yeah, of course that's true. Yeah, of course, I worship the sun. I think paganism is right. Clearly the universe is like spiritually charged and I should worship the universe." And I was like, hang on, this is so fascinating. And so I kind of think people are often hold lots of different contradictory views about the universe and about the world. And it's simply about almost kind of what works for them in some ways. I think there was an author, I think Tara Burton, who wrote this book called Strange Right. It's quite a popular book in this space. And yeah, I think she has this term called a spiritual bespokeification, a basically bespoke kit bash, a kind of spiritual mode that kind of works for them. Yeah, whatever that might look like. So I would say if you're not in the sort of community of people who are sort of land somewhere in a tradition, I think often you end up in a place that's kind of stable, but more your own personal construction of a religious faith, I suppose.
Okay, one last question. You can answer this any way you want, if you're brave enough to speculate. What happens next?
So I guess there's a few ways to answer that. One is going back to what we were saying earlier on about this is not just from our data, people are not just going as a social club. This is impacting their whole lives. And it seems to be impacting their lives positively. And they're embedding it, they're praying, they're reading the Bible. Now, anyone who's been involved in faith, you can go through periods where you are very vibrant and enthusiastic and others where it feels harder. So these things might wax and wane. But the fact is right now, it looks like Christianity is pretty embedded in these people's lives. So you wouldn't expect it to just drop off within a year or two. As a piece of data, it doesn't read like a fad. It reads like something that's going to stick. But the other side of what happens next is how does the church respond? Because if we've got this new wave of young adults getting involved in the church, I think the church needs to be ready to engage with these young people. And the key things I would say from the data are the reason they're turning up at churches, they're looking for personal connection. As we've said a lot, they're looking for community, but they're also looking, I think, for someone to guide them in what being a Christian means. They might have come across some stuff online that might have prompted their curiosity, but they're going to church maybe with the hope of someone who's a bit more mature, a bit more experienced to get alongside them, to live their life with them, and to kind of help them as an individual through that, in that community. So that's one thing. Like, is the church ready to mentor what we call disciple these young people? The second is the church ready to listen and kind of learn from these young people, because every stat has a story. All of these young people are going to be coming for different reasons. We speculate about these large cultural shifts, but actually every individual person has a reason that's drawn them there. And if church leaders are too presumptive, either to go, well, I know why they're here, or to go, they've come to me for my wisdom and guidance. So they can sit down and listen, and I will tell them. If we don't learn from them, if we don't listen to them, they're going to disconnect, understandably. They're going to feel like they're not, this is what they were hoping for. These guys, what are they talking about? This has nothing to do with my life, or this has nothing to do with where I'm at, or actually, and this comes on to the third one, like, I don't understand what they're saying. So if as a church leader, they're saying, okay, I'm going to get alongside this person, I'm going to listen to them and learn from them, and then I'm going to find the things that are going to be most suitable for them, you would imagine that would therefore continue to sustain these people in church and enable them to grow. But then you run this survey in 3 years' time, you run the survey in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, we don't know if it turns out that Gen X is just the least religious generation in British history and we never get there again, or if this is some weird statistical quirk which looks very different down the line. Everyone goes, what was that all about? That doesn't feel like that to me.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, Natasha Moore and Justine Toe. It's been good to have you back, Natasha.
Thanks, Simon. And thanks as well to Daniel Kim, to Rob Barward-Symmons and Bri Walsh for offering us some glimpses into the ways that the UK's spiritual and religious landscape is changing. This is a story that we at CPX are going to be keeping an eye on. If it's been of interest to you, we'd love you to share this episode with others who would also find these things surprising, maybe intriguing.
And as always, thanks to our producer, the quietly revolutionary Alan Douthwaite. Next time.
There are people who are trying to break news in their columns. There are people who are trying to make sure that new little bits of information come to light. I'm much more trying to give people new ways to think about whatever has happened recently. And absolutely, sometimes that means shining a light on things that most people are not talking about or thinking about.